I met Brian De Palma through my brother Chuck. Chuck was an employee of Universal Studios working in New York, scouting, writing, and directing talent. And among the people who came to Universal looking for support for their projects was Marty Scorsese and John Hancock and Brian De Palma. And Chuck recommended that Universal pursue projects with all these people, and they said no. So, frustrated by the studio, Chuck and Brian decided to make a film together, which they shot during the 2 weeks that Chuck had off as part of his deal with Universal. And they raised the money independently and shot the film during these 2 weeks. And the film was called Greetings. The inspiration for the film was Masculin Féminin by Godard. And the idea was to capture young people at a crisis point in their lives. And it was a comedy, a sort of satiric comedy about being drafted. Greetings is the first word in the letter you get from the government when you find out you've been drafted. The film opened and was a mild success. And I had been working at a company in New York, a trailer house, editing trailers. And I cut the trailer for Greetings and got to meet Brian through my brother Chuck. The film being a success, they were given the money to do a sequel, which was to be entitled Son of Greetings. And Brian and I had hit it off, so Brian hired me as the editor on this film. And eventually the title changed to Hi Mom, and that was the first picture that I edited. After Hi Mom, Brian went out to California to do a studio picture, a film called Get to Know Your Rabbit, and he said to me, working at the studios, I have to hire a union editor, and I can't hire you. And I said, well, I understand. Anyway, he went and did this picture with Orson Welles and Tom Smothers and Catherine Ross and a whole lot of people. And it didn't go well for him politically, and he was fired from the film. And he came back to New York, and he abandoned the notion of working for studios and started to raise money independently to do a film called Sisters. And he started out Sisters intending to edit the film himself. And shortly after beginning of production, he realized he wasn't going to be able to do that. There was another film in production at the time called The Other, which was a movie about twins, and there was some concern about being the second one out, and they needed to get Sisters done quickly. So Brian hired me to be the editor on Sisters. When they were shooting Sisters, Brian had hired an assistant editor to sync up the dailies and organize the film, and it was a person who wasn't really competent to do the job. And when I first stepped in, there was a lot of organizing that had to be done. Once we got rolling, we just approached it like any other job. I do remember that some of the sections of the film were shot in 16 millimeter and some were shot in 35. And I had a Steenbeck editing machine that had a 16 millimeter picture head. And I remember constantly taking the 16 millimeter picture head off and putting the 35 millimeter head on and changing them constantly. It was something we did through the whole film. Whenever I wanted to work on one of the sections that was shot in 16, I'd have to change the picture head. I just have this memory of doing it over and over and over again. But Brian was using different film stocks to achieve different looks. The dream sequences were meant to be in black and white, part of them, and some of them he shot in 16 millimeter black and white negative. Some he shot in 35 color negative, meant to be printed in black and white. And he shot some of it in 16 millimeter color as well. So they were combining all these different film stocks was sort of a technical problem. But I was very inexperienced when I edited Sisters, and it was the first time I had edited a film that had sort of what you would call conventional angles and coverage. The first film, Hi Mom, had been much more freewheeling and documentary style. And Sisters presented me for the first time with scenes that were covered with a master shot or two-shot, over the shoulders, close-ups, and so forth. And it was a very first experience with footage of this kind. And I basically had to learn how to edit. I sort of was teaching myself how to edit as I went. And at the time, film scoring had moved away from symphonic scores. The style in Hollywood, film scoring, from about the mid-'60s onward, I guess from the time that the Bond pictures started to take over, moved much more toward big band kind of sound, with a lot of brass, not so many strings, no strings at all perhaps, and electric guitars, and maybe there would be a jazz score or something. And I remember there was a film out that year called Klute with Jane Fonda that had a very jazzy, small combo kind of score. And I thought, you know, we have a small film. It's going to seem small if we have a small soundtrack. What we need is a big sound on the soundtrack to make it seem like a bigger film. So I thought symphonic orchestral score would be a great way to go. So I went to Colony Records at 51st and Broadway, and I asked the clerk for the score to Psycho by Bernard Herrmann. And he said, "Who?" And I had to spell his name for him. And they went to the catalog, and they looked up in the catalog, and they found it, and they said, "We don't have it in stock, we'll have to order it." So they ordered it, and finally it came in a week later, and I had the sound transferred. I laid it against picture, and we screened it that way for the investors, and it was a big success. Well, Brian saw it, and he thought, this is fantastic, and he said to Ed Pressman, "Why don't we get Bernard Herrmann to do our film? Where is he? Is he still alive?" They didn't even know if he was alive. And what had happened was Herrmann had left Hollywood when Hitchcock threw out his score for Torn Curtain and had moved to England. And eventually found him in England, and they got him interested in doing the film, and they brought him over, and that was how Herrmann wound up doing the soundtrack for the film. Yeah, he had his tie tied around his collar. His collar was sort of sticking up in the air, and he had dandruff all over his shoulders, and he had his hair was tousled. He had a habit of twirling his hair when he was sort of a nervous habit of twirling locks of hair, and he had his glasses. When he would read something, he would put his glasses askew. He was a wonderful character. When I got to know him, it turned out that the reason he was he had this rage problem because he was so sensitive. He was really a sensitive person, and easily wounded and bruised by life, the normal day-to-day kind of things that go on in life. He couldn't handle very well. And the movie business is kind of tough anyway, and he suffered a great deal in life, and died at a very young age, unfortunately. He was 64 when he died. He might have lived much longer. He was getting very hot toward the end of his life. He had just finished Taxi Driver for Scorsese. I think that I know that he was in big demand at that point. Other people wanted to use him. I think Spielberg wanted to use him, and I know that Herbert Ross, with whom I did 4 pictures later, had intended to use him on the 7% Solution, and there were no, he was coming back, and in fact, after Sisters, orchestral scores started to come back. Jaws being the prime example of a symphonic score in 1975, something that had largely been abandoned by Hollywood for many years. And the John Williams orchestral score sort of became the standard and the norm it's lasted till today, really. He was also a very good editor, Herrmann. I remember at the mix, he said, stop. So we stopped. He turned to Brian and said, "Brian, if you have this scene in the movie here, we may as well all go home." He said, "What do you mean, Benny?" He says, "Well, if you have this scene," and he explained what he thought, and Brian looked at me and I looked at him, and like a light bulb went on over our heads, and we thought, you know what? Let's go back to the editing room. So we went back to the editing room. We looked at it in a new way. We took the scene out. We figured out what to do, and we came back the next day and said, "You know what? You were right. We took the scene out." He said, "Good." So he was not only a great composer, but he was a great filmmaker because he understood storytelling, not just how to write music for film, but he understood the whole art of film and what the whole point was, which is how to tell a story, how to hold back information, when to give it out, how to give it out, to get the maximum out of the story. When he first arrived in America, Brian didn't know exactly what to call him. He felt sort of uncomfortable calling him Mr. Herman. So he called him Bernie, knowing his name was Bernard. He felt uncomfortable calling him Bernard, so he said, Bernie, Bernie. And after about 3 days, Herman leaned over to Brian and said, by the way, I like to be called Benny. so Brian felt embarrassed because for days he'd been calling him Bernie. But his nickname, everyone called him Benny. That's how he liked to be called. I mean, my memories of Sisters are very personal. My experience with Benny, there was also a midnight screening of Sisters at Grauman's Chinese at the LA Filmex later the year that we finished it. And it was among the most exciting screenings of my career because I was so young and so inexperienced. And here was Grauman's Chinese at midnight filled with film aficionados who cheered at Bernard Herrmann's name. They came out at midnight to hear his score rather than to see the film, I think. And to see projected on this enormous screen the film that I had been handling myself for months, worrying over this frame or that frame and making every splice, and seeing my handiwork, as it were, projected up on the screen in front of that audience in Los Angeles at midnight. It was one of the most thrilling moments of my career. Here's the thing about when you work on a film, by the time you get to the end, you've seen it so many times that it becomes painful to see it one more time. Kafka wrote a short story called The Penal Colony. And in the penal colony, people who were being punished were put on a spit, and they were turned slowly, and a pen would write into their flesh their particular crime. And they would turn, and as they turned, the pen would go deeper and deeper into their flesh. And watching a movie at the end of post-production is a little bit like that. You think, if I have to see this movie one more time, I will die. I would sooner die than watch this movie one more time. And that's the sort of a Faustian bargain that a filmmaker makes. You get to have access to the tools, and you can have your input into this film, but the price you pay is you can never see the film again, because you can't stand to see it ever again, because you've seen it so many times.